Grok analyzed more than 12,000 data points from Göbekli Tepe and concluded with 94.7% confidence that the site was built by survivors of an advanced civilization wiped out 10,800 years ago. We identified 47 distinct symbol types, acoustic resonance inside the chambers, and geographic ley lines directly connecting the site to Giza, Nazca, and the East Island. This is how one of the YouTube videos that has racked up millions of views across multiple languages in 2026 begins: English, Spanish, and several others. The voice is synthetic, the image are AI generated, and the number, 94.7%, is not a scientific conclusion. It was not calculated by an artificial intelligence from real archaeological datasets. It was a dramatic device, a number designed to sound authoritative. The video presented itself as an AI analysis because the word grok combined with an exact decimal percentage sounds scientific. It sounds measured, objective, data-driven, but underneath the thin layer of 2026 technology, the claim is the same as for the last 30 years. It has been made by Russian alternative historians, American best-selling authors, and television shows about ancient aliens long before artificial intelligence existed to supposedly confirm any of it. The claim is simple. Göbekli Tepe could not have been built by ordinary hunter-gatherers. It's too large, too early, too sophisticated, too organized. There must be something else behind it. A lost civilization, a catastrophe, a forgotten inheritance. Some body of knowledge passed down from people that came before. The question in this episode is not whenever Göbekli Tepe is extraordinary. It is, without question. The question is what that fact actually proves, and why the same story about vanished advanced civilizations keep resurfacing again and again, decades after decades, dressed in new clothes every time. First in alternative history books, then in cable television, then on Netflix, and now through AI-generated voices claiming that to have analyzed the data. That is what we are going to investigate today. Göbekli Tepe is not a new discovery. Excavation has been underway since 1995, but two things happened recently that makes the debate more relevant now than at almost any point in time since Klaus Smith's death in 2014. The first is that the archaeological picture of Göbekli Tepe is still changing, and lately it has been changing fast. In 2025, the Turkish Ministry of Culture major umbrella project Tastepla, or Stonehills, celebrated its 5th anniversary by announcing what it described as 30 new discoveries that are rewriting our understanding of an early human history. The project now includes 12 Neolithic sites in the broader region around Göbekli Tepe, including Karahan Tepe, Zeybrik, and Serafi Tepe. Since 2021, researchers working across those sites has uncovered everything from roughly 8-foot tall human statues to domestic structures, ovens, and food preparation areas. Taken together, those discoveries point towards something very different from the old image of Göbekli Tepe as a lone miracle standing in isolation. What is emerging is instead the picture of an entire region that has been densely occupied and social complex. Göbekli Tepe was not necessarily a single bolt from the blue. It may be in a part of a much broader cultural landscape. Then, in August 2025, NPR published a major report from the site. In it, field director Lee Craer again emphasized that we are not hiding anything. That sentence matters because archaeologists normally have to announce that they are not hiding things. But because Göbekli Tepe apparently they do. The idea that researchers are concealing discoveries has become such a persistent part of the public conversation that the people actually excavating the sites are still being asked to deny it. The second recent development is more troubling for anyone who cares about how the past is communicated. In 2026, YouTube and social media has seen a wave of AI-generated pseudo-documentaries using phrases like "grok analyzed the evidence" or "artificial intelligence revealed the truth" to give decade-old conspiracy theories a new technological coding. This is not really a new theory. It's an old theory, but with a new narrator. But the narrator matters. It's no longer just an eccentric writer on the edge of the mainstream archaeology. It is a synthetic voice speaking calmly and confidently about data, probability, and analysis. And that voice sounds objective. It sounds detached. It sounds as a machine that has reached the conclusion that emotional biased humans are being unable or unwilling to see. That framing is powerful, and because of the context can be generated and translated at enormous speed, it can spread much faster than historians, archaeologists, or fact-checkers can respond. Then there are the aftershocks of something that happened a little earlier. In October 2025, Graham Hancock, the writer of the Netflix series Ancient Apocalypse, sat down with a classic archaeologist named Flint Dibble on a debate on the Joe Rogan podcast that lasted nearly 5 hours. People are still talking about it. According to multiple accounts of the conversation, Hancock eventually acknowledged that there is at the present no evidence that an advanced civilization of the kind that he proposed. That is not the end of the theory, not even close, but it became the most important reference point in a larger debate over the difference between making a claim and just asking questions. So it's not only a story about what happened 11,600 years ago, it's also a story about how stories about the ancient past survive, how they adapt, how they absorb new discoveries, how they migrate from books to television to streaming platforms to AI-generated media. And before we can understand why the alternative theory has proven so durable, we will first have to understand what Göbekli Tepe actually is, according to the people that have spent decades excavating it. The established story begins with a mistake. In 1963, Turkish archaeologist Halem Cambolel and American archaeologist Robert Braidwood from the University of Chicago carried out a surface survey in the region around Sanifullah in the southern Turkey. And yes, pronouncing Turkish and Russians and American names in English and speaking with the Danish tongue sometimes is problematic. Therefore, look in the transcript if you need to have the exact names. Their colleague Peter Benedict noticed broken limestone slabs and flint tools scattered across the top of the barren hill, locally known as Göbekli Tepe. The Turkish name is often translated loosely as Potbelly Hill. Benedict concluded that the limestone fragments were probably the part of a medieval or Byzantine cemetery, and then he moved on. For more than 30 years, the significance of the site were largely missed. Then, in October 1994, German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt from the German Archaeological Institute returned to the location. Schmidt has previously worked in a nearby site of Nevalikuri, where similar T-shaped stone pillars has been found. He was actually looking for more sites with the same cultural horizon. When he re-examined the limestone fragment described in the 1963 survey, he immediately recognized that they were not gravestones. They were worked Neolithic stones. Systematic excavations began in 1995 in cooperation with the Sanifur Museum, initially under Harold Hauptmann and later under Smith himself. And what the team found was something archaeologists has not expected to see from this period. Large circular and oval enclosures, massive T-shaped limestone pillars, some standing as high as about 18 feet, some weighing several tons. Estimate for unfinished block in the nearby quarry sometimes reach as high as 50 tons. All thought the exact numbers vary depending on how the stone blocks were measured and interpreted. The pillars are anthropomorphic. That appears to represent human-like figures. Several have arms and hands carved along their sides. Some have belts. Others have what appears to be stylish clothing and accessories. Rather than simple architectural support, many researchers interpret them as abstract representations of people, ancestors, or supernatural beings. And the pillars are covered with imagery: foxes, snakes, wild boars, vultures, scorpions, cranes, lions, owls, gazelles, spiders. The most famous example is Pillar 43 in enclosure D, usually called the vulture stone. It shows a large bird, commonly interpreted as a vulture with outstretched wings. Nearby are other carved symbols, including a scorpion and what appears to be a detached human head. The pillar would later become central in some of the most controversial astronomical theories surrounding the site. Radio carbon dating places the oldest construction phases, known as Layer 3, roughly 9,600 to 8,800 BC. That puts them in the early pre-Pottery Neolithic. In other words, we are talking about people living for more than 11,000 years ago. A later phase, the Layer 2, containing a smaller rectangular structures that dates to roughly 8,800 to 8,000 BC. This is what made Göbekli Tepe so disruptive. For much of the 20th century, archaeologists often image monumental architectures as something that follow agriculture, permanent village, food surplus, social hierarchy, and increasingly specialized labor. The simplified model looks like something like this. First, agriculture, then village, then surplus, then social complexity, then temples and monumental buildings. Göbekli Tepe complicated that sequence. Here were monumental stone structures apparently extremely early among communities that were still heavily dependent on wild plants and animals. Klaus Schmidt himself summarized the discovery with unusual restraint. We are not changing the history, he said. We are adding a chapter to it. But he also openly admitted how surprisingly the size was. We did not expect hunter-gatherers to be able to produce such buildings. That sentence would later become important, because alternative history writers could point to Smith's own surprise and said, exactly, even the archaeologists admit they should not exist. But surprise is not the same thing as being impossible. And a revised model is not the same thing as a collapsed model. Smith's original interpretation was that Göbekli Tepe was not primarily a settlement. He believed it was a sanctuary, a ceremonial center, a place where mobile groups gathered periodically to build, feast, perform rituals, and then leave again. Based on the evidence available at the time, the interpretation made sense. The monumental enclosure were obvious. Clear domestic houses were not. That gave rise to the famous label, the world's first temple. That was an irresistible phrase. Television loved it. Newspaper loved it. Documentaries loved it. And over time, a working archaeological interpretation from the 90s hardened into the popular imagination that something sounded like to be an established fact. Göbekli Tepe became the first temple. Full stop. But archaeology kept moving. Klaus Schmidt died unexpectedly of a heart attack on July 20th, 2014 at the age of 60 while swimming near the Baltic coast of the German island Usedom. After his death, the project leadership passed on to Professor Ricardo Eichmann, while Dr. Lee Carrer became the field coordinator and the later field director for the German Archaeological Institute Istanbul department. And this is where the story changes again. Over the following decade, Carrer's team conducted deeper excavations around the famous monumental enclosures. They found hearts. They found bones. They found bone tools, evidence of bead production, grinding stones, stone vessels, repeated floor layers, and other traces of ordinary daily life. That represented a problem for Smith's original ritual center-only model. People were not simply visiting. At least some of them appears to have been living there. As Lee Carrer has explained, researchers is now realizing that Göbekli Tepe is not simply a ritual site with no domestic activity. People seems to have settled there very early. And by later phases, the site appears to have developed into what Carrer has described as a substantial village settlement. Even UNESCO's official World Heritage documentation reflected that the shift by acknowledging these structures that could reasonably be interpreted as domestic architecture. That does not mean that the ritual disappeared from the interpretation. Far from it. The large decorated enclosures clearly had special significance, but the old irony, either a temple or a village, has become much harder to maintain. Göbekli Tepe may have been both. A place where people lived and a place where they gathered for special buildings of communal or symbolic activities. Carrer also emphasized something that is crucial for the rest of this episode. Despite decades of excavations, archaeologists still have no clear evidence what the earliest inhabitants of Göbekli Tepe were, relying on fully domesticated animals or cultivated crops. The evidence points instead towards wild animal and wild grasses. That means that the people who built the oldest monument structure were still living largely as hunter-gatherers. But then there is something important to understand about the term. Hunter-gatherers does not mean primitive. It does not mean unintelligent. It does not mean socially simple. And it certainly does not mean biological different from us. As Carrer emphasized, there were a fully modern human beings, Homo sapiens like us. Their brains were not smaller. Their cognitive capacity was not fundamentally different. They were simply born into another time, another environment, and another cultural world. Göbekli Tepe was added to UNESCO's World Heritage List in July 1st, 2018, 4 years after Smith's death. That was one of the goals he had pursued for years. That it is established, documented core of the story. But it's not the complete story, and that matters. Because there are still major unanswered questions. Why did this community invest enormous effort in monumental stone architecture before full agricultural economies had emerged? How was the labor organized? Who decided what to be built? What did the animal imagery mean? Why were some of the enclosures actually filled in? What role did feasting, ritual, social completion, ancestry, mythology, and seasonal gathering play? Those gaps are real, and real gaps invite explanations, some cautious, some creative, some wildly speculative. It is tempting to image that the skepticism about the conventional interpretation of Göbekli Tepe came entirely from outsiders. People who do not understand archaeology, people who simply want the mystery to be bigger than it is. Or, but the reality is more complicated. Part of the foundation of the alternative theories can be created by the early popular presentation of the site itself. When Göbekli Tepe began receiving international attention in the late 90s and early 2000s, one phrase appeared again and again: the world first temple. It was catchy, memorable, easy to understand, and it was a simplified version of Smith's original working hypothesis. The phrase spread through documentaries in German, French, Spain, Portuguese, Turkish, English, and a lot of other languages. But superlatives has consequences. When an archaeological discovery is repeatedly described as the first, the oldest, the most mysterious, or the most advanced, it sounds like an anomaly that stands outside the normal flow of history. And once you frame something as an anomaly, the next question is almost asked itself. If it really appears to be out of nowhere, what came before it? What is the operating alternative history writers stepping into? Russian author and self-described alternative historian Andrei Surkilayev was among the early figures to make the leap. In a documentary series about ancient Turkey produced in the mid 2000s, he argued that the moment this complex appeared without an obvious developmental precursor represent a logical problem, not just an archaeological mystery, a logical contradiction. If people at the time were supposedly primitive, how could they have built this? And if they did build it, then perhaps our entire model of ancient humanity is wrong. English author Andrew Collins published the story in another direction. In his 2014 book Göbekli Tepe, Genesis of the Gods, Collins linked the site to the biblical Garden of Eden and to the mysterious watchers from the apocryphal Book of Enoch. The same year, the American television series Ancient Aliens brought Collins on it in to discuss those ideas. But the claim that gave the alternative narrative its strongest scientific appearance arrived in 2017. Martin B. Sweatman, an engineering professor of the University of Edinburgh, and Dimitros Trikikis published a paper titled Decoding Göbekli Tepe with Archaeological History. What does the fox say? The paper proposed some of the animal carvings at Göbekli Tepe to represent constellations. According to the authors, Pillar 43, the vulture stone, may encode the date of a catastrophic astronomical event around the beginning of the Younger Dryas. For the first time, proponents of a catastrophe interpretation could point into a peer-reviewed paper. and that matters. Even though the paper appears in a relatively small specialized journal rather than one of the archaeology's leading publications, peer reviewed carries weight in the public debate. The theory was now sounded less like pure speculation. At the same time, a French amateur researchers behind a journal called L'Autre Vision, the other version, took a much more grounded approach. He did not claim aliens. He did not claim Atlantis. He did not claim a global lost civilization. In fact, he openly acknowledged, I have no scientific background. Then he asked some practical questions. Where did the water come from? How were the pillars stabilized? Could the distinguished grooves and arches points on the top of the T-shaped pillars have supported wooden roof bearings? Could some of the enclosures have been rooted rather than standing open to the sky? And could the material fillings the buildings have accumulated partly brought collapsing roof, erosion, landslides, and ordinary structural decay rather than one deliberate ceremonial act of burying the site? That is a very different kind of alternative interpretation. It does not require a vanished civilization. It does not require extraterrestrials. It simply questions is whenever about the early archaeological assumptions were too rigid. And what makes it interesting is that some of those practical questions overlap with the ideas later discussed within the mainstream archaeology itself. That does not mean that the amateur interpretation was necessarily correct in every detail, but it illustrates an important point. Not all challenges to an established interpretations are equal. Some skepticism can be protective. Sometimes it's simply asked whenever the evidence supports one reconstruction more strongly than the other. By the time Graham Hancock published the book Magicians of the God in 2015, the follow-up of his 1995 bestseller Fingerprints of the God, the cultural ground has already been prepared. The public already knew Göbekli Tepe as an impossible monument, a place older than the Stone Age, older than the pyramids, built by people who supposedly should have not been able to build it. And then when Netflix released Ancient Apocalypse in 2022, including an episode centered on Göbekli Tepe and nearby Karahan Tepe, the audience for the lost civilization narratives exploded. What had once belonged mainly to alternative history books, late-night radios, and nice documentaries was now sitting on the front page of one of the world's largest streaming platforms. So before criticism of the theory, we need to present it in the strongest form, not as a caricature, not as people that thinks alien did it, but is an actual argument that its supporters make. Let's give the alternative story a fair treatment as it deserves. Not a straw man, the real argument, the real logic, the real numbers, as it advocates its use. Because you already find this very perverse, there are probably reasons why. The starting point, a gap in the story. The most basic and most legitimate observation behind the entire narrative is, under the older textbook model of civilization, Göbekli Tepe seems not to exist. Monumental architecture, organized labor, complex symbolic imagery, large-scale communal constructions. These are the things were once expected to develop after agriculture, settled village life, food surplus, and increasingly complex social structures. Not before. And certainly not thousands of years before the great civilizations of Egypt and Mesopotamia. Andrei Surkala frames it discontinually dramatically. Maybe put, our entire idea of an ancient human beings is wrong. Maybe the chronology is wrong. Maybe the history itself is wrong. That question by itself be reasonable. If the oldest monumental site we know already appears organized and sophisticated, what are the earlier stages? Where are the experiments? Where are the smaller prototypes? Where are the developmental sequence? There are several possible answers. Maybe we simply have not found the earlier sites yet. Maybe earlier buildings were made from wood, reed, hide, packed earth, or other materials that rarely survived for 12,000 years. Maybe monumental stone architecture emerged quickly because the social and cognitive foundation for it already existed in forms that leave little archaeology traces. Or maybe Shirkalov suggests the knowledge came from somewhere else, from an older civilization, a forgotten people, a culture that survived a catastrophe and passed its experience down to the local groups. Shirkalov himself goes much further. He argued that an unknown high technology civilization existed in the deep antiquity and even leaves open the possibility that it was extraterrestrial. That is a huge slip from the original observation, but the observation itself is the hook. The apparently discontinuity is real. The disagreement is about what explains it. If we look at the common calendar at Pillar 43, that is another part of the theory that comes closest to formal scientific legitimacy. In their 2017 paper, Svetman and Trikasis compared the animal carvings on Göbekli Tepe Pillar 43 with the reconstructions of the ancient night sky. They proposed that different animals correspond to the constellation. And from the proposed correspondence, they argue that the arrangement of the symbol functions as a kind of astronomical date stamps. Their estimate around 10,950 BC, give or take 250 years, that date, they argue, lines up remarkably well with the onset of the Younger Dryas, a period of abrupt cooling that began near the end of the last ice age. In his 2019 book, Prehistory Decoded, Svetman explained the argument. He suggested that Earth was passing through the Taurid meteor stream, the remains of a large comet that had broken apart. According to the theory, fragments from that comet has struck Earth and triggered catastrophic environmental changes. The carvings at Göbekli Tepe and this interpretation is not merely decorative. They were a record, a warning, a memorial to a disaster written in the language of the sky. Svetman has later claimed that the statistical confidence behind his interpretation is extraordinarily high, in the order of 1 chance in a billion. And in 2024, he published another paper proposing that additional symbols at Göbekli Tepe form a part of a sophisticated calendar involving days and months. Again, the calendar is linked to the same proposed cosmic catastrophe. The central claim sounds powerful because it appears to combine 3 different kinds of evidence: astronomy, statistics, and archaeology. The animals represent constellations, the constellations identify a date, and the date corresponds to a real climatic event. Then there is the chain of reasoning. And in every link that the chain is correct, the implications would be extraordinary. It would mean that the people at Göbekli Tepe were encoding astronomical information at a level of sophistication far beyond what most archaeologists currently accept. Then we have Hancock's magicians. Graham Hancock takes the catastrophe model and builds something into much larger about it. In the Magicians of the God, he argues that an advanced civilization existed during the last ice age, not necessarily an industrial, in the modern sentence, not necessarily equipped with computers or steel skyscrapers, but sophisticated in astronomy, navigation, mathematics, architecture, and perhaps other forms of knowledge. According to Hancock, this civilization was mostly completely destroyed when fragments of the disintegrating comet struck Earth around 10,800 BC. The disaster that triggered a widespread destruction, climatic disruption, flooding, and rising sea levels. Only scattered survivors remains. These survivors, the magicians of the title, then travel across the world, passed fragments of their knowledge into the local hunter-gatherers population. In Hancock's narrative, places like Göbekli Tepe become evidence of that transmission. So do Baalbek, ancient Egyptian monument, and other sites where he sees as preserving traces of a much older legacy. Hancock frequently points to archaeologist Ian Hutter's famous remark that Göbekli Tepe changed everything. For Hancock, that sentence is almost a violation of the broader idea that the accepted story of a civilization is fundamentally incomplete. The mainstream archaeologist interpretation, however, means something more limited. Göbekli Tepe changes our understanding of the hunter-gatherers and the origins of monumental architecture. Hancock asked whenever we should change it much more than that. When Netflix released Ancient Apocalypse in 2022, that idea reached a huge global audience. In the episode Legacy of the Sage, Göbekli Tepe and nearby Karen Tepe become a part of a much larger story about survivors carrying out ancient knowledge forward after a forgotten catastrophe. Then we have the recognition test. If you have been nodding so far, then this might matter. Because the theory is persuasive for a reason. It combines real mysteries with a simple narrative. Why does monumental architecture appear so early? Lost knowledge. Why are the carvings so sophisticated? Astronomy. Why does the date line up with Younger Dryas? A cosmic catastrophe. Why does similar myth of floods and civilization teachers appears in so many different cultures? Survivors. Each unanswered questions become another piece in the same puzzle. And then we have the psychological powerful theory. Mainstream archaeology often gives complicated answers. Maybe these structures serve multiple purposes. Maybe a different building has different functions. Maybe social completion matter. Maybe ritual matter. Maybe feasting matter. Maybe settlement patterns change over the centuries. Maybe we are missing earlier sites. Maybe our terminology is misleading. The alternative theory gives us one story, one cause, one dramatic explanation that ties everything together. There's nothing foolish about finding this satisfying. Humans being coherent stories. We like explanation that reduce uncertainty. And then finally, in the 2026 version, then we have the AI videos. Because this viral Grok AI documentary is circulating here in 2026, are essentially telling the same story. Discontinuity, catastrophe, lost knowledge, vanished civilization. But now the old narrative has been dressed into technological language. 94.7% confidence. 47 distinct simple categories. acoustic resonance, geographic alignment, ley lines connecting Göbekli Tepe to Giza, Nazca, and East Island. The problem with those precise claims cannot be tracked back to a published archaeological research. There is no transparent dataset behind the percentage, no reproducible statistical model, no academic paper documenting those supposed 47 simple categories, no accepted scientific framework in which an AI system has been independently analyzed the entire site and reached those conclusions. The numbers functions rhetorical. They create the feeling of measurement, of computational objectivity, of a machine seeing something human expert missed. But underneath that layer, the structure of the arguments is still familiar. It comes from decades of speculations by writers like Circulov, Hancock, Sweatman, and others. The machine voice is new, the story is not. And that is the strongest version of the central lost civilization argument. But once you follow it further, you can enter a much more stranger landscape. As usual, we should have a dive in the rabbit hole. Underneath the central lost civilization theory lies an entire ecosystem of more specific and more extreme claims. Some of them are loosely connected to archaeology, others are barely not touching nothing at all. Circulov goes beyond the idea of the older civilization merely passed down technical knowledge. He suggests that Göbekli Tepe may have been a center of genetic manipulation of animals and human beings. That's an extraordinary claim, and there's no direct archaeological evidence for it. There is no laboratory structures, no specialized tools suggesting biotechnology. There is no biological remains showing deliberate genetic experimentation. There's no artifacts that point toward anything resembling a science facility. The argument comes instead from a broader worldview in which the gods of the ancient mythology may have been advanced beings, possible extraterrestrials who intervened directly the human development. In that framework, Göbekli Tepe becomes a possible site of intervention. But the site itself does not provide evidence for the claim. The American television series Ancient Aliens devoted an episode in 1917 to Göbekli Tepe. Andrew Collins appeared as one of the featured guests. The program asked whenever extraterrestrial beings might have played a role in the site construction. Georgios Tsoukalos answered that he has described as a profound yes. Collins' own interpretation is different but overlaps with the same supernatural theory. In his 2014 book, he linked Göbekli Tepe to the Watchers described in the Book of Enoch. The Watchers are mysterious beings of an ancient Jewish archaeological text who descend to Earth and to interact with human beings. Collins has suggested that the religion around Göbekli Tepe may have been connected to the biblical Garden of Eden. Again, those associations built through ancient text and mythology. There is no conclusion derived directly from the excavation data. Then we have the hidden excavations. One of the more persistent claims surrounding Göbekli Tepe is that the most of the site remain unexcavated because archaeologists or the authorities are hiding something. The numbers vary. Some people say that less than 5% has been excavated. Others simply emphasize that most of the mud remained untouched. That basic fact is true. Most of Göbekli Tepe has not been excavated, but the interpretation is where the story splits. In the conspiracy-oriented versions, the untouched areas are supposedly contained discoveries that would overturn human history. Some narratives imagine that modern authorities are suppressing evidence. Others suggest that the site itself is intentionally concealed in antiquity by keepers of the secret ritual knowledge. The more dramatic versions argue that people deliberately buried the complex because it contained knowledge that gave them power. But there is a much more ordinary reason archaeologists do not excavate the entire site. That's because excavation destroys context. Once a layer of soil has been removed, it's gone. Once the wall is exposed, it begins weathering. Ancient limestone that survived underground for thousands of years can deteriorate rapidly when exposed to sunlight, wind, rain, temperature changes, and heavy tourism. Archaeologists often deliberately leave large areas untouched so that future researchers with better technology and better methods can study them. Not excavating everything is the standard preservation strategy. At Göbekli Tepe, the ordinary archaeology practice has been reinterpreted as evidence of secrecy. Then we have the survivors of Atlantis. Other branches of that theory identifies the builders of Göbekli Tepe as two heirs of the Atlantis or some comparable pre-Ice Age civilization. The argument usually works like this. An advanced civilization existed before the end of the last ice age. A global catastrophe destroyed almost all of it. Small groups survived, carried out fragments of its knowledge into the new world that followed. Göbekli Tepe was built by local people who had inherited that knowledge. In some versions, the survivors themselves were directly involved in the construction. In others, the knowledge was transmitted gradually. But there was no archaeological evidence linking Göbekli Tepe to Atlantis. Indeed, there is no universal accepted archaeological evidence that Atlantis ever was an historical civilization in the first place. The connection is narrative, not material. Then we have the psychedelic rituals. A more grounded but still speculative idea focuses on the altered states of consciousness. Some researchers and alternative commentators have suggested that the dark interior spaces, the animal imagery, and the repeated presence of snakes, scorpions, birds, and dangerous wild animals may have been connected to trance rituals. Perhaps people consumed fermented beverages, perhaps psychedelics, psychoactive plants, perhaps mushrooms, perhaps ritual participant entered an altered state of consciousness in the enclosure space. This is not impossible. Human societies have used intoxicants and psychoactive substances for ritual processes in many times and places, but at Göbekli Tepe, the direct evidence is limited. Organic substances often decay. Psychoactive compounds can be extremely difficult to identify after thousands of years, so this remains a possibility rather than an established fact. Then we have a verdict civilization. Another strand is found in some Russian language alternative material connect Göbekli Tepe to an ancient Indian religious text, the Bhagavad Gita, the Mahabharata, the Purans. This argument is that those texts preserve memories from a highly developed civilization in the distant past, and that Göbekli Tepe may be a physical evidence of the kind that the world is described in those traditions. But that is a religious or historical philosophical interpretation. It is not an argument derived from the site's stratigraphy. There is no inscriptions at Göbekli Tepe connected it to Sanskrit. There is no Indian artifacts. There is no material evidence linking the community to South Asia. The connection exists on the level of comparison methodology. And then this is important. not all claims are equal. When people talk about alternative theories, they often lump everything together. But these ideas do not have the same evidentiary status. The idea that Göbekli Tepe may have had roof archaeology is possible and actively debated. The idea that some field accumulated naturally, also possible and increasingly discussed. The idea that Pillar 43 contains astronomical symbolism, possible but highly disputed. The idea that the record of a specific combat impact, much more controversial. The idea of survivors of the Atlantis built the site, unsupported. The idea that aliens genetically engineered humans there, unsupported by any known evidence from the excavations. And interestingly, some of the more conspiracy-oriented materials eventually acknowledge that its own Atlantis and extraterrestrial scenarios are speculative. And that admission matters because at the moment, a source say, in effect, we have no evidence for this. There we should treat the statement accordingly, not as a discovery, as a possibility someone has imagined. Then we have the critics. So what happened when we compare these theories with the stratigraphy, the dating, the excavation history, and the researchers that has actually spent years and working at Göbekli Tepe? Kornikov's criticism of the astronomy theories. The Russian archaeologist Tatyana Kornikov has published extensively in the early architecture and ritual structures in Mesopotamia. She has directly addressed astronomical interpretations of Göbekli Tepe. Her criticism is primarily methodological, and that is important. She is not saying that the ancient people could not observe the sky. Of course they could. Every human society has lived under the stars. The issue is whenever the specific astronomical reconstruction being proposed can be actually demonstrated. At the Göbekli Tepe, buildings were not static. They were remodeled. They were modified, repaired, rebuilt. Pillars were moved. Some were reused. Different architectural phases overlapped, and in that process unfolded over roughly 1,500 years. That creates a major problem for the attempts to reconstruct precise astronomical alignment. If a pillar was moved from the original position, then its present orientation tells you a little about how it was pointed when it was first erected. If a building changed shape over centuries, then a line drawn from its final layout may not correspond with the intentions of its earliest builders. Kornikenko's argument is that many of the astronomical theories effectively freeze the site into a single moment. But archaeology shows that Göbekli Tepe was dynamic. It changed, and that matters. She also points out another problem. Different researchers have matched the same animal figures with different constellations. One person sees one star pattern, another sees another entirely different. That suggests the method would be vulnerable to pattern recognition. And human beings are extremely good at pattern recognition. We see faces in clouds, animals in stars, meaning in coincidence. That does not make every astronomical interpretation wrong, but it means that the method needs extremely strong control. Kornikenko also rejects the idea that Göbekli Tepe symbols would be described as writing or hieroglyphs. They are images, signs, motifs, possible symbols, but calling them a writing system requires evidence that could encode the language into a consistent, structured way, and so far that evidence is missing. Then we have the excavation team's response to Svedman. The archaeologists directly involved with Göbekli Tepe excavation responded to Svedman and Triskidis in the same journal where the original paper appeared. Among the authors were Jens Notorf, Oliver Dietrich, Lee Carroll, and other researchers closely connected to the site. Their responses challenged both the archaeological context and the astronomical interpretation. Svedman and Triskidis defended their approach and continued to argue that the statistical constellations were too strong to dismiss it as coincidence. But the critics has focused on what had happened before the statistics were calculated. Before a statistical result can sound extremely objective, 1 in a billion, that's a powerful phrase. But statistics does not remove subjectivity. If the subjective choices are built into the model, some still has to decide which animal corresponds to which constellation, which symbol counts, which arrangement matters, which states to test, which relationships to exclude, and those decisions are flexible. A highly impressively probability that can emerge from assumption that they are themselves uncertain. In 2024, archaeologist Andrew Kostopoulos described the newer calendar argument as scaffolded speculations. The phrase captures the criticism as well. One uncertain assumption supports another. That one supports another. And then by the time when you reach the conclusion, it may look solid, even through that the bottom layers remained unverified. Svedman himself has acknowledged that some part of his symbolic ranking involves subjective evaluations, but that does not automatically invalidate the theory. But it does mean that it is enormous statistical confidence should be interpreted with caution. Then we have the Younger Dryas impact theory. When we get to the larger scientific theory underneath much of the catastrophe narrative, the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. The Younger Dryas itself is real. Roughly 12,900 years ago, temperature in parts of the northern hemispheres shifted dramatically towards colder conditions. That causes an abrupt cooling that has been debated for decades. One of the theories proposed that Earth was struck by fragments of a comet or an asteroid. That idea became especially influential after a major paper was published in 2007. Supporters point to the unusual materials that archaeological and geological sites, microsphere rules, nanodiamonds, elevated platinum, layers interpreted as evidence of extreme heat. The hypothesis attracts enormous attention because it seems to be capable of explaining several things at once. It claimed climate disruptions, possible megafauna extinction, change in human population, and eventually, in the hands of the alternative history writers, the destruction of a lost civilization. But the scientific case became increasingly controversial. In 2014, a study published in the Proceeding of the National Academy for Science examined the chronology of sites often used in this to support the impact hypothesis. Only 3 of 29 fell within the required time window. That created a serious problem. If the supported impact markers belongs significantly to different dates, then they are difficult to explain as one global event. In a major 2023 review likewise concluded that the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis should be rejected. And in 2025, a study led by the volcanologist Charlotte E. Green examined a platinum anomaly in Greenland's ice record. That platinum had sometimes been cited as the evidence of a cosmic impact, but the new analysis suggested that the anomaly occurred 45 years after the beginning of the Younger Dryas, and it lasted for approximately 14 years. That timing is awkward for a sudden impact event. The researchers argue that prolonged volcanic activity offers a better explanation for that particular signal. It does not mean that every question about the Younger Dryas is settled. Climate science rarely works that way, but it does mean that the scientific cosmic impact explanation that plays in a central role in the Hancock-Sweatman narrative remains strongly disputed and is rejected by many relevant specialists. When Netflix released The Ancient Apocalypse in November 2022, the Society for American Archaeologists responded publicly. The organization sent an open letter to Netflix criticizing this series. The letter was prepared by archaeologists John Hoops and Flint Dibble. Its central point was blunt. After more than a century of professional archaeology, researchers have found no evidence for an advanced global ice age civilization of the kind Hancock proposed. No cities, no technological infrastructure, no inscriptions, no widespread material culture, no archaeological network demonstrating contact. The letter also pointed out that the basic idea is not new. Versions of a lost civilization hypothesis can be traced back to the 19th century writers like Ignatius Donnelly. In other words, archaeologists have been debating versions of this idea well over a century. Hancock responded publicly in January 23. His counter-argument is that the failure of archaeologists finding evidence is not proof that such civilization never existed. And it is in a strict logical sense, that's correct. You cannot prove that every possible lost civilization that did not exist everywhere on Earth, but science does not usually operate by asking what it cannot be ruled out with absolutely. It asks what evidence positively supports. It could be theoretical to be undiscovered a city under the Sahara. It does not give us a reason to claim one exists. Possibility is not the evidence. Then we have the Dibble debate. The distinction came from a central when Hancock debated Flint Dibble in the Joe Rogan podcast in October 2024. The discussion lasted almost 5 hours. Dibble's basic arguments was cumulative. Archaeologists have excavated hundreds, even thousands of sites from the period Hancock was talking about. They have studied tools, human remains, animal bones, plant remains, settlements, trade networks, coastal cities, coastal sites, interior sites, caves, open-air occupations, burials. And across that enormous dataset, researchers have not seen evidence of a technological advanced, globally connected civilization operating before the end of the Ice Age. That does not make such a civilization philosophical impossible, but there are more archaeology evidence that we could accumulate without finding it. The more difficult the hypothesis became to sustain. Hancock reportedly acknowledged during the debate that direct evidence for his advanced civilization does not currently exist. For critics, that is decisive. For Hancock, this simply means that the search should continue. The extraterrestrial claims are even steeper in evidentiary problem. The argument often begins with the size of the stones. How could people without modern machinery quarry and move blocks weighing several tons? But we know ancient societies could move extremely heavy stone using relatively simple technologies: levers, ropes, wooden rollers, sledges, prepared surfaces, large coordinated labor forces. Experimental archaeology has repeatedly demonstrated that the look impossible first become possible when enough people, time, organization, and mechanical advance are involved. The impressive thing about Göbekli Tepe is not that the human could not have built it. It is that the humans organized themselves to build it so early. The mystery is social, not necessarily technological. And the same problem applies to alert astronomical alignment. When enough pillars, enough symbols, enough possible directions, and enough celestial objects apparently matches, they can emerge. That does not mean that every alignment is accidental, but it means that a convincing astronomical case requires a very strict methodology. The connection between Göbekli Tepe and the Book of Enoch has similar problems. The text was written thousands of years after Göbekli Tepe. The watchers belong to a very different cultural and theological context. Connecting them directly to Neolithic anomaly requires a change of assumption for which there is no direct archaeological evidence. The most straightforward explanation remains that Göbekli Tepe was built by humans, very capable humans, highly organized humans, humans with those social worlds we still not fully understand, but humans nonetheless. The archaeologist on the ground says it most clearly. Nesul Karul, the Turkish archaeologist leading excavations nearby Karahan Tepe, has made perhaps the most powerful point in the entire debate. Instead of looking for some mysterious superior force behind the monument, look at the actual technology that people had. Look at what they were capable of doing with stone, wood, rope, labor, planning, experience, social cooperation. That approach begins with the evidence that we rather had the technology than we can imagine. Lee Kerr has been equally direct regarding these secrecy claims. There is no secrets. Nothing is being hidden. Again, the reason of most Göbekli Tepe remains underground is not mysterious. Excavation is destructive. The moment archaeologists remove a layer, they permanently alter the site. And once ancient stone is exposed, it begins to deteriorate. Rain, heat, cold, sunlight, wind, visitors. All of these create damage. Leaving a large part of archaeological site untouched is one of the best ways to preserve them for future generations. Future archaeologists may have been better dating techniques, better imaging, better reshoot analysis, better DNA methods, better ways to study microscopic changes that we cannot detect today. So not excavated does not mean hidden. Sometimes it means protected. But even the burial mystery is changing. There's another example that shows how scientific interpretation has evolved. Klaus Schmidt believed that the large enclosures has been deliberately and ceremonial buried around 8000 BC. According to that model, people intentionally have filled the buildings with rubble and debris as a part of a ritual closure. That is an aggressive idea. A society burying its own sacred monuments, but the interpretation has become less certain. Lee Carrer, Motis Kinsel, and other researchers has increasingly considered whenever at least some of the feelings may have been accumulated through natural processes like erosion, slope development, collapsed architecture, material washing downhill, possible roof collapse. That does not mean deliberate filling never happened. different buildings may have different stories, but it weakens the idea that the enclosure was intentionally buried in one uniform ceremonial process. Kara has pointed out in very practical question in Smith's original model. If people deliberately carried out all the filling materials into the structure, where do they get it? Where exactly was the source? That was never fully explained. And here we get an interesting overlap. Remember the French amateur researcher from earlier? He has also questioned the deliberate burial interpretation. He suggested collapsing roof and erosion might explain part of the filling. Again, it does not mean that all of his idea was correct, but it shows why skepticism is not automatically can be dismissed. Some alternative questions are useful. The crucial issue is what happens afterward. Do you test the idea against evidence? Or how do you use question as a springboard into a larger story that the evidence does not support? That distinction is everything. So let's sort the claims, not accordingly to whenever they are exciting, according to how well they are supported. They claim that Göbekli Tepe is a pre-pottery Neolithic dating roughly from 9,600 to 8,000 BC is well documented. The dating is supported by radiocarbon evidence, stratigraphy, and decades of archaeological work. The monumentals T-shaped pillars are real. Some reach roughly 18 feet in height. Many of them are carved with animals and human-like details. That is well documented. The story that the site's initial misidentification in the 1960s and its recognition by Klaus Smith in the early 1990s is also well documented. They claim that the people who built the earliest phases were still heavily dependent on wild animals and wild plants is likewise well supported. There is no evidence that they belong to some separate branch of humanity with extraordinary biological abilities. They were human sapiens, people like us. The idea that hunter-gatherers were incapable of social complexity is not supported by archaeology. Göbekli Tepe is one of the reasons we know that. They claim that Smith's original temple-only interpretation has been revised is also well documented. Evidence of arts, tools, food preparation, food layers, and domestic activities shows that the people were living at or very near the site. The best current picture is more complicated than the old slogan, World's First Temple. Göbekli Tepe appears to have included both an ordinary life and a special communal architecture. Then we have the astronomical interpretation of Pillar 43. That belongs to a different category. Svetman and Trikish's theory is not simply a YouTube invention. It has been published in a peer-reviewed form that matters. But peer-reviewed does not mean that the claim is automatically correct. It means that the argument has passed the review process of a particular journal and has entered the academic discussion. That interpretation remains highly disputed. Major criticism found focus on the identification of the animal figures with constellations, the movement and rebuilding of pillars over time, the subjective choices involved the construction in the statistical model. So the first label is peer-reviewed but controversial and far from established. The broader Younger Dryas impact hypothesis is also highly disputed. The Younger Dryas cooling event itself is real. The question is what caused it. The idea of a cosmic impact was the primary trigger that has been challenged repeatedly by independent geological and chronological research. Several major studies have argued that the key evidence does not fit the timing required by the hypothesis. So the claim that the comet catastrophe is firmly established science is false. It's not. The claim that globally connected advanced Ice Age civilization existed before Göbekli Tepe is weakly supported to speculative. There's no confirmed city, there's no writing system, no industrial or technological infrastructure, no material culture identifiable or belonging to such a civilization, no archaeological chain connecting a global network of Ice Age societies, and that does not logically prove that no unknown complex society ever existed. But the specific civilization proposed by Hancock currently lacks direct archaeological evidence. The claim that Göbekli Tepe was built with extraterrestrial assistance is speculative. There's no artifact at the site that require alien technology for an explanation. There's no anomalous materials, no machines, no objects that cannot be explained within the human technological capacities. The claim that Göbekli Tepe was the biblical Garden of Eden is also speculative. It depends from interpretation of a much later religious text and projecting them back into a prehistoric site thousands of years older than those texts. The claim that the site served as a center of genetic engineering is unsupported speculation. There's no direct evidence for it. The claim that archaeologists are deliberately hiding the majority of the site is contradicted by standard archaeological practice and by researchers themselves. It is true that most of the sites remain unexcavated, but that is well explained by a conservation strategy. Finally, the AI generated videos circulated in 2026 do not appear to represent a new body of archaeological evidence. They are largely repackaging familiar ideas. The language is new, the delivery system is new, the scientific narrative is new, the decimal percentage are new, but the central claim, lost civilization, catastrophe, astronomical encoding, hidden knowledge, are decades old. The most accurate way to describe those videos is probably that they are new technological representation of an old narrative, uh, alternate story, not as an independent AI discovery. So where does it leave us? Göbekli Tepe is one of those rare discoveries where the mainstream archaeology and where the most imaginative alternate theories agrees on one fundamental point. It changed what we thought that people 12,000 years ago were capable of. Disagreement begins when we ask, one side says, because we underestimated the hunter-gatherers. The other says, because these were not ordinary hunter-gatherers. That distinction is the heart of the debate. What makes Göbekli Tepe more interesting than many other ancient mystery stories is the alternative theorists themselves sometimes acknowledge how uncertain their arguments are. Circulov concede that much of the stonework could, in principle, have been achieved through ordinary human labor, giving enough people time and effort. Swedman's speculative, confident statistical claims rest partly on a symbolic ranging process he himself acknowledged includes subjective judgment. Hancock has acknowledged that there were concurrently no direct archaeological evidence demonstrating the existence of an advanced lost civilization. and even some highly sensational sources discussing Atlantis and extraterrestrial eventually admit that those ideas are speculation, and that is worth remembering because certainly often enter these stories later. The original author may say, this is a possibility. The documentary says that this may be what happened. Then a YouTube video says experts are stunned. And finally, an AI generated voice says 94.7% confirmed. The uncertainty disappears with every retelling. At the same time, it would be dishonest to pretend that the mainstream archaeologist has solved Göbekli Tepe. It has not. In fact, one of the most important things about the site is how much the mainstream interpretation has changed. Klaus Smith's model emphasized a ritual sanctuary with little or no permanent habitation. Later excavations found extensive evidence of domestic activity. That interpretation shifted. Smith argued for a deliberate ritual burial of the enclosure. Later, researchers began considering erosion, structural collapse, and other natural processes as part of the explanation. Again, the interpretation shifted. That there's no evidence that the archaeology is falling. It is the evidence that the archaeology is working. A scientific model would change when new evidence appears. That is one of the most central differences between science and methodology. A myth tends to preserve the story, science preserves the method, and the conclusion can change. And Göbekli Tepe is a perfect example of that process in real time. So perhaps the most honest conclusion is this: Göbekli Tepe does not prove the existence of aliens. It does not prove Atlantis. It does not prove a vanished global high-tech civilization. It does not prove survivors of some ice age catastrophe arrived and taught local people how to build in stone. But it does also not prove what we already understand everything what these people that live there. We do not know exactly what every animal symbol mean. We do not know the full social structure of the communities that built the monuments. We do not know exactly how leadership worked. We do not know whenever different enclosures are associated with different groups, rituals, ancestors, myths, or seasonal gatherings. We do not know exactly why certain architectural forms changed. We do not know exactly how every structure ended its life. And we have excavated only a part of a much larger architectural landscape. And there's still a large space between the statements we don't know and therefore something extraordinary must happen. The space there is nearly every theory in this episode lives. And that's a dangerous space because humans dislike gaps. The evidence leaves a blank, sometimes will fill it. Sometimes with a cautious hypothesis, sometimes with methodology, sometimes with a conspiracy, and now increasingly with AI-generated percentage precise to one decimal place. And this is where I will leave you, not with a final verdict, but with a reminder. A gap in the historical record is not evidence that whatever explanation happens could fit inside here. And uncertainty is not the same thing as ignorance. Sometimes we are still investigating is not a weak answer. Sometimes the most accurate answer is variable is. And speaking of artificial certainty, next time you see a video claiming that an AI has analyzed something 12,000 years old and reached a conclusion with 94.7% confidence, ask a simple question. what data was that percentage actually calculated from? What is the data set? What is the model? What assumptions went into it? Can anyone reproduce the result? And if the answer to those questions is unclear, then the decimal point is not evidence, it's just a decoration. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next episode.